Today, we're basically going to learn about the concept of why do countries trade with each other, okay? And first things first, we need to understand what is international trade. But understand something, okay? And politicians often simplify this way too much. They make it sound like, you know, trade is like everything else. It can just be turned on and off like a light switch. You know, oh, we want to trade with China. So the president calls up China and says, hey, trade with us. And China says, okay. And we say, oh, we don't want to trade with China anymore. We can say, oh, hey, China, don't trade with us anymore. And China will say, well, we don't like that, but okay. And, you know, that is not how it works, okay? Why do you trade with the store? Why do you trade with the restaurant? You know, why do you go buy things from the restaurant? Why do you go buy things from the store? Because they have something you need and are willing to sell it to you at a price you're willing to pay, right? They have something you need. They're willing to sell it to you at a price you're willing to pay, okay? So that's why we trade, right? The same thing goes for goods that cross borders. They have something we need at a price that we're willing to pay. And we're not talking about, you know, China has something, you know, we need. The bottom line is that individual companies buy from other individual companies. You know, capital goods or even consumer goods are bought from individual countries or companies. They're not bought from countries per se. So, you know, for example, if Apple needs to source a screen for its iPhone, and the company that is willing to provide those screens is based in China, Apple is going to purchase them from the company, maybe called, yeah, it's probably Foxconn or Gator Glass or something, you know, whatever the company's name is. They're purchasing from a company that is located in China. They're not purchasing things from China, okay? They're purchasing things from individual companies. And just like individual people trade, individual companies trade with each other as well. And, you know, I don't go, when I go to the store, I go to Target or go to Best Buy, whatever, I'm not sitting there going, man, I want to buy some Vietnamese-made clothes today. Or I want to buy a Chinese-made television today. No, what I'm doing is I'm going to Target and saying, you know, hey, I need to buy new socks. I'm going to Best Buy and saying, hey, I need to buy a new television. What kind of TVs do they have? And I'm not looking on the box to say, no, was it made in Korea? Was it made, you know? I'm saying, oh, the Samsung is a nice television for a cheap price and, you know, at a price I'm willing to pay, I will purchase it. And so just to understand that goods and services move across borders because they are purchased by individual companies who are in turn trying to sell them to the individual consumers. The one thing that happens is that, you know, when we go to the ballot box, we tell politicians we don't like free trade. We don't want stuff getting imported. You know, we want to seal the borders and make everything here. But when we go to Walmart, when we go to Best Buy, when we go to Amazon, when we go to the store, we say the exact opposite. We like the low prices that trade brings. We don't like, you know, the job loss or the lower wages or things like that, but you can't have one without the other. You can't have the low prices without some of the trade-offs as well that happen, okay? So we have lost manufacturing jobs. Can those jobs be made up in other areas? Given the fact that we have largely been at full employment for the better part of the last 40 years, the answer has largely been yes, okay, that those jobs have been made up in other areas. And as a result, our standard of living is better because what we have done is by importing goods that are more efficiently and cheaply made in other countries, what we do is we free up our labor, we free up our businesses, we free up our land and capital to do things that are more productive and more efficient for us. And so we have the benefit of both the goods coming in and the services coming in, but also the labor being freed up to do things that are more productive. And so we are now certainly a more service-based economy. So what we may not do is manufacture the good, but we've got a whole lot more stores to sell the goods. We've got a whole lot more places and ways to purchase those goods because of the fact that our labor force has been freed up to do more deliveries, more trucking, more shipping, more warehousing, more, to fill store shelves more, more cataloging and selling on store shelves, to open more stores and the like. And obviously that's a very simplified way of looking at it, but that is the overall reason why you see international trade. Okay. Trade between nations is similar to trade between individuals. We benefit from specialization and exchange. Okay. And so understand, what we learned at the beginning of the course is that we all benefit from specialization. It is not out of the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, and the baker that, they're not necessarily doing, cutting meat, brewing drinks or baking bread because they just want to do it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because they can make a profit, because they can sell the excess bread and the excess drinks and the excess meat that they produce for money to buy the goods and services that we want. And what that does is it frees us up to do what we're best at and produce excess and surplus of those things. For me, it's teaching economics. For your parents, it may be accounting. It may be accounting. It may be it may be something else. It may be screen printing. It may be law. It may be teaching as well. We can produce excess and then sell that excess for money and then trade that money for the things that we need. And as a result, more things get produced because I don't have to cut my own meat, make my own drinks, bake my own bread. I am now free to do something that I am better at, and society is better off. Okay. Because we don't have to focus on low-level manufacturing, we are now free to do things that add more value to our economy. And, again, there's no such thing as the economy. The economy is the millions of interactions that happen every single day. But we are free to do that which is most productive for us. And so just like individuals, individual economies also specialize in what they do best. And in the case of the United States, it's not low-end manufacturing. It is high-tech stuff. It is minerals like oil. It is food, producing food. It is, and it is services. And what are the things that those all largely have in common? They require a significant amount of education. They require a significant amount of capital. And they generally lead to a higher paid workforce. Okay. What is the thing that, low-end manufacturing has? Generally requires very little education and thus has a very low paid workforce. So, and so by specializing and then trading from its surplus, a nation can produce more of a good or service than it could have before. So, and again, understand that nations do not trade. Individual firms trade, individual people trade, and those goods will cross borders. And that said, opposition to trade, even though international trade is something that we say we want every time we go to Walmart, every time we go to Target, every time we go to Best Buy, is politically popular. And, obviously the last few years have shown that, but it has been a politically popular position for both Republicans and Democrats. And yet, economically, it doesn't make a lot of sense. When we look at the effects of restricting trade, we find that we don't like restricting trade as much as we thought we did. So, and understand something as well. Imports are about 15% of GDP. exports are about 13% of GDP. So if we want to limit trade, what we're saying we want to do is we want to limit those 15% of imports, but you cannot do that without alienating the countries you're trading with, and that will reduce those 13% of the GDP that is exports as well, and you end up with slowing your economy down. And so the net effect of international trade right now is about 2% of the GDP. Okay, our exports minus imports is negative 2% roughly. Okay, so now that works out to about $650 or so billion, which sounds like a lot, but it's about 2% of our country's GDP. So why do countries trade? Okay, they trade from a position of comparative advantage. Okay, and this is where people get mixed up, because what they see is absolute advantage. Okay, what we see is absolute advantage, and absolute advantage is just simply the ability of a country or an economy to produce more of a good than another country. So, for example, if the U.S. can produce 100 tons of steel and Mexico can produce 50 tons of steel, we have an absolute advantage of 50 tons of steel. So we can produce 50 more tons of steel than Mexico can. Therefore, it's an absolute advantage. We can produce more. And what a lot of politicians will see is, oh, we can produce more of this, therefore we don't have to import any of it. Therefore, if we import stuff, that costs jobs. Therefore, let's not import any. Let's just produce all of our own steel and not allow any steel to be imported at all. But the thing is, what if we need more than 100 tons of steel? So what if we can produce our own steel, but then import so we can have more? Because again, all countries are limited by the production possibilities frontiers. There's only so many goods and services available at any given point in time in a country. And so just because we can doesn't necessarily mean we should. Let's say we need 150 tons of steel. Well, right now we're capable of producing 100 tons. So now to get those extra 50 tons, we're going to have to divert resources from another area that might be more productive for us to be able to produce those tons of steel. Okay. So that's, I think, an important thing to understand. Okay. And so nations do not necessarily trade from a position of absolute advantage. And I think that's what some people expect. And certainly that has been a hallmark of Donald Trump's presidency, is that, hey, we can produce X, why are we importing it? And his viewpoint of imports and exports is one that's common, and it is not something that is unique to one political party, because this is a viewpoint that we've seen Bernie Sanders voice just as much as Donald Trump, which is the idea that when we import things, when we buy stuff made in other countries, we are losing per se. You know, when we export, we're winning, but when we import things from other countries, that we are losing. And, you know, that is an admission of failure, and that is a good that is a lost job here, because that is something that we could have produced here, and, you know, and therefore we're preventing somebody from having a job. That said, a lot of times those concerns are voiced at a time when we are at full employment. Okay. And so, and the real problem with that as well is that, you know, that comparative advantage could be, or that absolute advantage might mean, again, we have to divert resources from more productive sectors of the economy to less productive sectors to produce stuff that we could import, and then free up our labor, free up our land and capital as well to do things that are more productive. So, comparative advantage is the ability of a country or an economy to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another country. The key thing to understand is nations do not trade from a position of absolute advantage. Nations trade from a position of comparative advantage. Okay? And so take a look at this here. Okay? So the United States can produce 50 tons of steel or 100 tons of grain. Okay, so steel, grain. We can produce 50 tons of steel or 100 tons of grain. Okay, so that means for us, 1 ton of steel equals 2 tons of grain. 1 ton of grain equals 1/2 of a ton of steel. Okay, so we have enough capacity to do one or the other. So every time we produce a ton of steel, we give up the opportunity to produce 2 tons of grain. Every time we raise a ton of grain, we are giving up the opportunity to produce 1/2 of a ton of steel. Okay. Meanwhile, Japan can produce 40 tons of steel or 40 tons of grain. So 1 steel equals 1 grain. Each time they make a ton of steel, they give up the opportunity to produce a ton of grain and vice versa. Okay. So what does this mean? Okay. So let's say we both spent 1/2 of our time producing steel. Okay. We would produce 25 steel and Japan would produce 20. We would produce 50 grains and Japan would produce 20 as well. So there would be 45 steels and 70 grains. Okay. Now, what if we went to Japan and said, okay, clearly, we have an absolute advantage in both, right? We could produce 10 more tons of steel and 60 more tons of grain if we put all of our resources to either one. So we can produce more of both. So we have an absolute advantage of 10 tons of steel and 60 tons of grain. What if we went to Japan and said, you know what? We're better at making grain. We're not quite as good at producing steel. So why don't you produce 40 tons of steel and no grain, okay? And we will produce 10 tons of steel and we will spend the rest of our time on grain, okay? Now, to produce 10 tons of steel, for each ton of steel, we have to give up 2 tons of grain, so we have to give up 20 tons of grain. However, look at what happens, okay? At the end, we have 50 tons of steel and 80 tons of grain combined, okay? So we have a net gain of 5 tons of steel and 10 tons of grain because we both specialized. Japan specialized in steel, and we spent 80% of our resources on grain and 20% on steel. And as a result, the world economy benefits from 5 tons of steel and 10 tons of grain because we specialize. And so what we can do is we can go to Japan and we can say, all right, we will trade our excess grain to you for steel. And as long as the price of grain for us is higher than 1/2 of a ton of steel, or as long as the price of buying steel from Japan is less than the price of 2 tons of grain, it's a good deal for us. It's also a good deal for Japan because they will profit because they will make more money from us buying steel from them than they would be and selling them grain than they would be in them producing the grain themselves. They'll make more money selling steel to us. And because it costs them 1 grain, if we pay them anything above 1 grain, 1 ton of grain for their steel, we're good. And we benefit as well because we then can sell because the grain costs us less. The steel costs them less. Okay. And the key thing to understand is we can produce more. Okay. So that's the basic idea of comparative advantage. And understand then, to understand comparative advantage, you have to understand opportunity cost. You have to look at what you have to give up to get what you want, rather than rather than just who can produce more.